There is a street in Frankfurt where the light falls differently. It's narrow, running between houses so old and so close that the upper stories seem to lean toward one another, conspiratorial, protective. The Germans call it the Judengasse, the lane of Jews. By day, it echoes with voices. By night, it becomes something else. A place where the boundary between inside and outside, between permitted and possible, grows thin. In 1744, in one of those leaning houses, a child was born. His name was Mayer Rothschild. He would never leave that lane, not truly. But his sons would carry what he built to 5 cities, 5 nations, and remake the map of money itself. This is not a story of conspiracy. It is a story of something more ordinary and more remarkable. A family of dealers in coin who became, without quite meaning to, the bankers of empires. Within 1 generation they lent to kings. Within 2 they shaped wars. Their name would become synonymous with gold, with power, with the hidden geometry of finance itself. And it would begin not with a fortune, but with the smallest, most fragile of things, a reputation for keeping a promise. I am the keeper of the ledger. I have read the entries from Frankfurt to London, from Paris to Vienna, in faded ink, in neat hand, in the language of accounts that admit no lie. Before we begin, if you'd like the ledger opened again next week, the subscribe button is just below. Best to press it now while the lamp is still lit. Dim the lamp. I'll keep the ledger. The Judengasse was not a place of beauty, though it had the beauty that comes from density, from layers, from history pressed into every corner like ink into parchment. Jews had lived in Frankfurt since the 12th century, but it was only in the late 1600s that they were forbidden to do so anywhere else within the city. They were confined to this single street, and the street, over generations, turned inward. Houses rose higher, floors stacked upon floors. Windows looked not outward, but at other windows. The ground floor was for business, the upper stories were for living, for the careful domestic arrangements that made a life within a boundary. Mayer Rothschild's father, Amschel Moses, was a dealer in coins and medals, a numismatist, as they would say later, lending the work a weight it perhaps did not need. But it was honest work. Coins were more than currency. They were history, art, the flattened memory of empires. A prince might commission a medal. A merchant might chase a rare coin across 2 continents. And in Frankfurt, where the banking houses were beginning to gather like birds before a storm, a man who understood the true value of money, who could read a metal, assess a date, understand the stories embedded in weight and image, such a man was useful. Amschel Moses died in 1755. Mayer was 11. The boy had been apprenticed, as custom demanded, to a banking house in Hanover, in the service of a man named Oppenheim. Hanover was not Frankfurt. It was farther, larger, and the work was different. It was here, in ledgers and in the careful recording of who owed what to whom and when, that Mayer learned the grammar of finance. He learned that money, like language, follows rules, and that a man who knows the rules can make himself understood in rooms far from home. But the Judengasse called him back, or perhaps it was simply the fact that his mother, Schönche, needed him, and that in Frankfurt there was work to be done. By his early 20s, Mayer had returned to the lane where he was born. He took over his father's business, coins, medals, a small shop with a few rooms behind it. He was scrupulous, patient, And he had learned in Hanover what many dealers never learned, that the real wealth in dealing is not in the individual transaction, but in being the person whom everyone trusts. There were perhaps 200 Jewish families in the Judengasse by the time Mayer reached adulthood. The street was a complete world, sealed off not just by law, but by custom. There were kosher butchers, teachers, scribes, a rabbi, an entire commerce conducted within those narrow boundaries. And within those boundaries, there was no one to appeal to but one's neighbors. If a man kept his word, he prospered. If he did not, the news traveled the length of the street in hours. In such a place, reputation was not an ornament. It was infrastructure. It was the only thing that held the whole structure up. Mayer Amschel dealt in this most precious commodity. He acquired rare coins, medieval medals, pieces of metal that had been handled by collectors for centuries. He studied the history of each piece, when it was minted, what prince had commissioned it, what wars or marriages or coronations it commemorated. He understood that a coin was a small, heavy argument for the permanence of a particular world. And when a collector or a prince came to him asking for something specific, he did not ask if the price was high. He asked only, "Where is this coin in the world, and how can I bring it to you?" This was not a path to immediate wealth. The Judengasse was prosperous in its way, but it was still a ghetto, still constrained by law and by the jealousy of the Christian merchant classes outside. The restrictions were precise and humiliating. Jews could not own land in Frankfurt. They could not leave the lane after sunset. They could not marry without permission from the civic authorities, who placed quotas on marriage licenses as if limiting the birth of Jews themselves. At the gates of the lane there were guards, both to keep Jews in and, in the civic mind, to keep danger out. But within this confinement there was also a peculiar kind of freedom. The Jewish community of Frankfurt had learned, over centuries, how to make money move through forms that the law had not explicitly forbidden. They understood bills of exchange, credit transfers, the delicate choreography by which a sum of money in one city could become, through the intermediary of a written promise, a sum in another. They understood credit because they had to. The law had forbidden them from many simpler forms of commerce, and so they had been forced into sophistication. Mayer Amschel absorbed all of this. He was not the first dealer in coins in Frankfurt, but he was, by all accounts, the most conscientious. Collectors would come to him with desires, sometimes specific requests, sometimes only a vague sense that something beautiful and old existed somewhere in Europe, and they wanted it. Mayer Amschel would not rest until he found it. He developed a network of dealers across Germany, across Europe. Through letters and through the careful movement of agents, he could locate a coin minted 300 years ago in a city he had never visited, and he could bring it to Frankfurt, to his small shop on the Judengasse, and place it in the hands of the man who had dreamed of possessing it. It was not a large business, not yet, but it was becoming known. By the 1760s, when Mayer Amschel was in his 20s, there was a growing appetite among the German nobility for the visible tokens of classical learning. Medals, coins, antiquities. These were the furniture of an educated prince's cabinet, the proof that he was not merely a warrior or a ruler, but a man of taste, of erudition. And Mayer Amschel had positioned himself perfectly to serve this hunger. He kept meticulous records. He understood that in a world where trust was everything, documentation was sacred. He wrote down what was bought, what was sold, what was promised, what was delivered. He wrote it in a careful hand, in accounts that never lied. And slowly, month by month, the name Rothschild became a name that meant, "This man will deliver what he promises." In a world of princes and courtiers and elaborate deceptions, this was rare. This was valuable. This was, in fact, everything. In 1765, when Mayer Rothschild was 21 years old, a change was beginning to germinate in the politics of Hesse-Kassel, a state in the heart of Germany. Wilhelm, the future Landgrave, was a young man, not yet born into power, but destined for it. And like many young men of the nobility who had been educated in the classical tradition, Wilhelm had developed a passion. He wanted medals, he wanted coins. He wanted to surround himself with the material evidence of a civilization he admired, but could never fully inhabit. The story, as it has been recorded, is that Wilhelm heard of Mayer Rothschild. He heard that there was a dealer in Frankfurt, a Jew in the Judengasse, who had a particular genius for locating rare coins, for understanding their provenance, for knowing, as if by second sight, where in Europe a treasure might be hiding. And in the way that such rumors traveled among the nobility, Wilhelm resolved to acquire some coins. He sent word. Mayer Rothschild received the commission. What happened next was simple, but it altered the trajectory of his life. Mayer Rothschild did not disappoint. He acquired for Wilhelm a medal collection that was admirable, valuable, and, most importantly, authentic. Every piece was what it claimed to be. Every piece had a history, a story, a proven lineage. And when the young Prince Wilhelm received them, he was not just satisfied, he was astonished. He had expected a transaction. He had received instead an education. A relationship was forming, though neither man could have predicted where it would lead. Wilhelm was not yet powerful, he was merely the heir of a powerful man. But the admiration was genuine. Mayer Rothschild was not wealthy, but he possessed something that seemed to Wilhelm to be wealth's secret core: knowledge. He understood value, he understood history, he understood how to tell the difference between a thing that merely looked precious and a thing that was genuinely rare. By 1769, when Wilhelm became the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, Mayer Rothschild had been elevated to an official position. He was now the Hoffaktor, the court factor. It was a title that would have been remarkable for any man of the Judengasse. For a man still under 30, it was extraordinary. A court factor was responsible for managing the finances of a prince. He arranged loans, brokered deals, moved money across borders in the complex choreography of German politics. It was a position of tremendous trust and tremendous danger. Wilhelm was not a man of simple tastes. He was, in fact, a man of expensive tastes. He wanted to expand his territories, fortify his borders, hire the most capable generals. He was, in short, a typical German prince of the era, ambitious, threatened, perpetually in need of money. And in Mayer Rothschild, he discovered something that few courtiers could provide: a man who did not simply spend money on his behalf, but who understood money itself, who could make money work harder, travel farther, accomplish more. The relationship deepened. By the early 1770s, Mayer Rothschild had become something more than a coin dealer. He was managing funds for Wilhelm. He was arranging loans. He was understanding the complex mathematics of interest, of time, of trust, stretched across borders and years. And, crucially, he was managing all of this from outside the conventional apparatus of power. He was not a lord. He was not a courtier. He was a Jew from the ghetto, which meant that he could be dismissed, eliminated, destroyed at any moment. But it also meant that he was not part of the feudal structure of obligation and resentment that bound together Wilhelm's Christian advisors. He owed allegiance only to the man who employed him, not to the ancient claims of nobility or land. This was a position of extraordinary vulnerability, but also of extraordinary opportunity. Wilhelm's confidence in him was not abstract. It was grounded in results. Every promise was kept. Every transaction was recorded. Every piece of gold or silver that passed through Mayer Amschel's hands was accounted for, down to the last coin. By now, the coin dealing had become a secondary business. The real work was finance. Mayer Amschel was moving money across the continent. He was arranging loans that would support armies, that would allow a prince to maintain independence in a Europe that was being reshaped by the ambitions of Prussia and Austria and France. He was learning something that few men of his time understood, that in the modern age, military power and financial power were becoming the same thing. The prince who could borrow money could hire soldiers. The merchant who understood credit could shape the destinies of nations. And Mayer Amschel, sitting in his small house in the Judengasse, was learning to see this connection. He was not a visionary. He was simply a careful man who understood that if you kept your promises, more and larger promises would be offered to you. If you moved money accurately and without theft, you would be asked to move larger sums. If you could arrange a loan of 100 gulden, you might soon be arranging a loan of 100,000. By the late 1770s, Mayer Amschel had accumulated a modest fortune. Not vast by the standards of Christian merchants or aristocrats, but substantial for a man who had begun in a ghetto, with a father who had been a dealer in coins. He had married, in 1770, a woman named Gutel Schnapper, who came from a respectable family of merchants. They began to have children, many children, in the way of successful Jewish families of the era. First Amschel in 1773, then Salomon in 1774, then Nathan in 1777, then Kalman in 1788, finally Jacob in 1792. These sons would be educated not as dealers in coins, but as dealers in something larger, in the movement of money itself, in credit, in the delicate architecture of loans and contracts and promises that was beginning to replace the older, simpler world of gold and land. Mayer Amschel was not training merchants. He was training something new, international bankers. By the 1790s, when the first rumblings of revolution were being heard from France, Mayer Amschel Rothschild had made a decision that would set his family apart from every other merchant family in Frankfurt. He was going to distribute his sons, like seeds, across the continent. Not all of them would stay in Frankfurt. Not all of them would remain subject to the constraints of the Judengasse. Instead, each would establish himself in a different city, in a different nation, and all of them would be bound together by something more powerful than geography, by family interest, by shared capital, by a network of communication and trust that would become, over time, the most formidable financial organization in Europe. The oldest son, Amschel Mayer, would stay in Frankfurt. He would expand the family business there, managing the relationship with Wilhelm and establishing the Frankfurt banking house that would serve as the headquarters of the enterprise. Amschel was the steady one, the conservative one, the guardian of the home base. Salomon, the second son, would go to Vienna. Vienna was the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, soon to be the capital of the Austrian Empire. It was a city of power, of intrigue, of vast sums moving through the hands of the imperial government. Salomon would establish himself there and learn to navigate the treacherous politics of the Austrian court. Nathan, the third son, was different. He was quicker-witted than Amschel, more adventurous than Salomon, with a temperament that seemed incapable of settling. He was sent to England, to Manchester, the heart of the Industrial Revolution. Manchester was not a capital of political power, not yet, but it was becoming the capital of something equally important: commercial innovation. The textile mills of Manchester were beginning to transform the world. Nathan would go there and learn to move goods, to understand credit, to become fluent in the language of commerce that was replacing the older language of courtly favor. Kalman, later known as Karl, would go to Naples, to the kingdom of the two Sicilies, to establish banking connections in a region that was increasingly important to European trade and politics. And Jacob, the youngest, would go to Paris. Paris was the heart of French power, of culture, of the intricate world of European high finance. But in the 1790s, Paris was also in the grip of revolution, and to send a young Jewish banker to Paris in 1792 was to send him into a firestorm. This scattering of sons was not accidental. It was strategy, though Mayer Amschel would never have used such a grandiose word. He had learned, in his long career as a court factor, that money moved across borders. Wars were financed from one city and fought in another. A prince in Hesse-Kassel would pay for soldiers with coins that originated in Vienna or London. The flow of capital was beginning to define European politics more profoundly than the movement of armies. By placing his sons in the great cities of Europe, Mayer Amschel was creating a network. Not a conspiracy. The records are clear that it was all above board, all documented, all conducted with the permission of the rulers of each nation. But a network nonetheless. A family that could move money from Frankfurt to Vienna, to Naples, to London, to Paris, without relying on the official banking channels of any single nation. A family whose members could communicate through letters and through trusted messengers, coordinating their actions across the continent. Each son would bring with him capital, knowledge, and the family name. They would establish banking houses under variations of the Rothschild name. They would begin, cautiously at first, to accept deposits, to arrange loans, to trade in bills of exchange. And when a merchant in London needed to pay a creditor in Vienna, or when a government needed to move a large sum across national boundaries, the Rothschild network would be there, ready to facilitate the transaction, ready to take a commission, ready to profit from the gap between what money was worth here and what it was worth there. But in the 1790s, all of this was still in the future. For now, Mayer Amschel was in his 50s, prosperous but not yet wealthy, respected but not yet powerful. His sons were young men in foreign cities, learning languages, learning trades, learning the 1,000 small skills that would allow them to survive and eventually to thrive in the difficult world of international commerce. The oldest son, Amschel, was in Frankfurt, learning his father's business directly, sitting in the rooms where Mayer Amschel conducted his affairs with Wilhelm and with other German princes. He was being trained in the careful choreography of court finance, in the delicate art of lending money to rulers without offending their dignity. Salomon, in Vienna, was experiencing something entirely different. Vienna in the 1790s was a city of Baroque grandeur, of imperial ambition, of a court that was beginning to feel threatened. The French Revolution had sent shockwaves across Europe. Napoleon was beginning his rise, and the Austrian Empire, old and proud and increasingly fragile, needed money more than it had ever needed money before. Nathan, youngest of the first generation to be sent abroad, arrived in Manchester around 1798. He was barely more than a boy, not yet 25, with a limited command of English and a great deal of ambition. Manchester was not Vienna or Paris. It was a city of merchants and manufacturers, of commerce conducted in a dialect of English that was rapid, colloquial, far from the formal German of the court. But Nathan had advantages that many of his rivals did not. He had access to family capital. He had the ability to move money from Frankfurt. He had family members in other cities who could facilitate transactions, who could help him understand the complex networks through which goods and money moved across the continent. And he had something else, a temperament that was suited to commerce. Where Amschel was careful, Nathan was bold. Where Salomon was cautious, Nathan was aggressive. He began in textiles. Manchester was the heart of the textile trade, and Nathan, using his family connections and his access to ready capital, began to deal in cotton cloth and other manufactures. He would buy directly from the mills and sell to merchants across Europe. He understood that the key to this business was speed and volume. If you could move a large quantity of goods quickly, your profit per unit could be small, but your total profit could be large. By 1802, at the age of 25, Nathan had established himself firmly enough in Manchester that he was able to send regular letters back to Frankfurt, updating his father on his progress. He was prosperous, though not yet wealthy. He was accepted, though not yet fully integrated into the merchant class. And he was beginning to understand that the real money was not in textiles themselves, but in the financing of textiles. This is where, gradually, the Rothschild network was beginning to take shape. It was not a sudden transformation, not a dramatic moment of rebirth. It was the slow accumulation of experience, the gradual deepening of relationships, the careful building of reputation. Mayer Amschel, now in his 60s, was seeing his vision realized. His sons were scattered across Europe, each learning his trade, each establishing his credentials, each preparing to take advantage of the vast opportunities that were being created by revolution, war, and the transformation of commerce. He could not have known, in 1800, that within a decade Napoleon would be reshaping Europe, and that the Rothschild family would be positioned perfectly to profit from the chaos. He could not have predicted that by mid-century they would be the richest family in Europe. But he had set in motion the logic that would make these things possible, the logic that in a world of borders and warfare and shifting alliances, the family that could move money across those borders, that could understand credit and trust in ways that transcended national loyalty, would be the family that would survive and prosper. In 1798, when Nathan Rothschild arrived in Manchester, he was not yet the figure he would become. He was a young man, dressed in the style of a German merchant, speaking an English that was halting and accented, a stranger in a city that was transforming itself daily into something new and strange to everyone. He was 21 years old, sent by his father Mayer Amschel, with capital, instructions, and the weight of family expectation. Manchester in the 1790s was not yet a metropolis. It was a market town that had stumbled, almost accidentally, into the centre of a revolution. The factories along the rivers, the Irwell, the Medlock, were multiplying. Fortunes were being made and lost at a dizzying pace. Men who had been farmers were becoming manufacturers. Men who had been manufacturers were becoming industrialists. The old hierarchies of wealth and power were dissolving, replaced by something more fluid, more violent, more purely driven by profit. The air was thick with cotton dust and wood smoke. The ground was perpetually damp from the rivers and from the output of the mills. The people moved with purpose and speed, each person calculating, assessing, watching for advantage. Nathan rented a small space, established himself as a dealer in textiles, and began the work of learning. He was young. He could afford to be slow. His advantage was not experience, but access. The family in Frankfurt could send him bills of exchange, essentially promises of payment drawn on the family's credit. With these, he could purchase cloth directly from the manufacturers, circumventing the usual middlemen who would have taken their own profit. He could then sell that cloth to exporters, who would ship it to the continent and beyond, to merchants who had contracts to supply distant markets. The margin on each transaction was thin, perhaps 2 or 3%, but the volume could be large. If he could move £10,000 worth of cloth through his hands, his profit would be £200 or £300. If he could move 50,000, his profit would be running into the thousands. For the first few years, he operated in relative obscurity. There are references to him in letters and documents, but nothing that would suggest he was destined for greatness. He was a young merchant, doing what young merchants did. He was cautious in his dealings, careful to maintain his credit, quick to settle his debts. He lived modestly. He did not spend his money on display or on the fashionable entertainments of Manchester society. He worked, and he wrote letters to his father in Frankfurt, reporting on his progress. But even then, in these quiet years, Nathan was learning something that would be crucial to his later success. He was learning how to move money. He was learning the intricate choreography of bills of exchange, of credit transfers, of the delicate mechanisms by which sums in one currency could be converted to sums in another, across borders that had tariffs and restrictions and every sort of official obstacle. He was learning that money itself was not a fixed thing, but something that could be divided, moved, transformed, combined. He was learning that the key to profit was understanding the difference in the value of money in different places and at different times. He was also learning the landscape of Manchester commerce, who could be trusted and who should be avoided. Which manufacturers produced reliable goods that would not return to haunt you with complaints? Which export merchants were solvent and would honour their debts, and which were merely bright talkers who would vanish when payment was due? Which routes to the continent were most reliable, and which were vulnerable to disruption? Which agents could be relied upon to conduct transactions honestly? He was building, slowly, a map of commerce in his mind, a mental geography in which every merchant was a point, every relationship a line, every transaction a potential circuit through which money could flow. By 1802 or 1803, Nathan had accumulated enough capital and enough reputation that he could begin to transition from being a simple cloth merchant to something more ambitious. The wars with France were creating opportunities that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. Britain was spending vast sums to prosecute the conflict, millions of pounds annually, sums that dwarfed the ordinary commerce of peace. Money was flowing through the country like water through a sluice. The government was borrowing, the military was purchasing, the economy was inflated by warfare spending. And Nathan, with his connections to Frankfurt, with his ability to move money across borders even in wartime, was beginning to see possibilities that other merchants could not see. His brothers were beginning to establish themselves in other cities. Salomon was in Vienna. James was navigating the complexities of France. These connections meant that if Nathan could arrange for money to flow through Frankfurt to Vienna, or if he could coordinate the movement of goods from Manchester to the continent, coordinating with his brothers at other points, he could create advantages that a local merchant could not achieve. The textile trade would continue. It was profitable, and it provided a cover for his other activities, a legitimate reason for him to maintain correspondence with merchants across Europe. But increasingly, Nathan's real business was becoming financial. He was beginning to take deposits from other merchants, promising them a return. He was beginning to trade in bills of exchange on his own account, betting on currency fluctuations, on the movements of gold and silver across the continent. He was beginning to understand that the money in commerce was not in the goods themselves, but in the financing of the goods, in being the person in the middle who could move money from someone who had it to someone who needed it. By 1805, Nathan had established what was, to all appearances, a small but respectable banking house in Manchester. It was not yet the N.M. Rothschild and Sons that would become famous. It was simply Nathan's operation, conducted from modest premises, a rented house with a counting room on the ground floor and living quarters above, with a handful of clerks and assistants. But it was there, and it was functioning, and it was profitable. He was handling transactions not just in textiles, but in bills of exchange, in credit transfers, in the delicate work of moving money. More importantly, Nathan had established something more valuable than profit. He had established a character. He had become known as someone who could move money reliably, who understood international commerce, who could be trusted with large sums. The merchants of Manchester began to come to him not just to buy cloth, but to ask for his advice on financial matters. If a man needed to pay a debt in Vienna, he would come to Nathan and ask if the Rothschild network could arrange it. If a merchant had funds he wanted to move to a safer location, he would bring them to Nathan. He was not yet rich, but he was beginning to accumulate the reputation that would later allow him to become rich. He was beginning to understand, in the years of obscure commercial work in Manchester, the principle that would later elevate his entire family, that trust is more valuable than gold, and that a reputation for honesty and competence could be invested in like land or manufacturing, yielding returns across years and decades. Every transaction he completed honestly, every promise he kept, every account he balanced without discrepancy, these were deposits into a bank account of reputation that would pay dividends for the rest of his life. By 1808, the character of European warfare had fundamentally changed. Napoleon had conquered much of the continent, annexing territories, deposing kings, reorganizing the map according to his vision. The British, under the leadership of people like William Pitt in earlier years and later the Duke of Wellington, had responded by organizing coalitions against him, by refusing to surrender, by committing ever larger resources to the conflict. Money became the sinew of warfare in ways it had never been before. In the feudal world, Wars had been conducted by professional soldiers who were bound to their lords by ties of obligation. In the age of Napoleon, wars were conducted by conscripted masses supplied by industrial production, paid in coin, sustained by logistics organized on a continental scale. A British soldier fighting in Spain against the French needed to be paid. If he was not paid, he would desert. His supplies needed to be purchased from local merchants, and local merchants would not accept the word of a British officer that they would be compensated after the war ended. They wanted money in hand. His ammunition needed to be manufactured in Britain and transported across the ocean to the Iberian Peninsula, and every stage of this process cost money. The horses that carried him, supplied him, moved the artillery needed to support him, all needed to be fed, and grain cost money. None of this could happen without money, and by 1812 and 1813, as Britain's wars on the continent intensified, as Wellington's campaigns moved deeper into Spain and toward France itself, the British government was facing a problem that was becoming acute: how to get large sums of gold from London to the Iberian Peninsula, where Wellington's armies were fighting in the midst of enemies who controlled the sea lanes and the land routes. This was not a theoretical problem. Gold is heavy, 40 or 50 pounds per cubic inch. Moving it across ocean and mountain in the midst of warfare, in the presence of enemies who would very much like to capture it, was an extraordinary logistical challenge. A naval vessel carrying British bullion was a target for French privateers and for the French Navy itself. Land routes had to be guarded against bandits and against French military patrols. Conventional banking channels were disrupted by the wars. The normal routes through which money moved, routes that had existed for centuries and that depended on a certain level of international trust, were now unsafe. No merchant ship would carry British gold without an armed convoy, and no armed convoy could guarantee safe passage. It was at this moment that the Rothschild network became indispensable. By 1812 and 1813, the brothers were operating banking houses in Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples, London, and Paris. They could move money in the conventional ways, but they could also move money in ways that bypassed the conventional channels. They could use family connections, private messengers who were trusted because they were family, routes that were known only to themselves and to the government, routes that avoided the standard sea lanes and the standard roads. They could move gold from London to Spain by circuitous paths, through Amsterdam, through Lisbon, through Cadiz, through routes that seemed to the outside world to be purely commercial transactions, but which were, in reality, the organized movement of military supplies. Nathan Rothschild was now in his mid-30s, established in London, where he had moved his operation from Manchester several years earlier. He had rented premises in the City of London, the financial centre, and had established N.M. Rothschild and Sons as a banking house of some reputation. He had the trust of the British government. He had accumulated access to large sums of capital through his trading activities and through deposits from merchants who trusted him. Most importantly, he had what no other London banker had. He had a brother in Frankfurt, a brother in Vienna, a brother in Paris, and a brother in Naples. This network, which Mayer Rothschild had constructed over decades of careful relationship building, was now proving its worth. It was not a network that had been built for this purpose, to fund warfare, but it turned out to be perfectly suited for it. The arrangement was not secret, though the details were carefully guarded. The British Treasury, through its agent John Charles Herries, worked with Nathan Rothschild to arrange for the movement of gold and silver to pay Wellington's troops. The gold would be purchased in England. This was straightforward, if expensive, then converted if necessary to foreign currency, and then moved through channels that have never been fully documented and that would likely not be publicly confirmed even today. What we know is that it moved. Somehow, improbably, in the midst of a war that was supposed to have cut off communication and commerce between Britain and the continent, gold found its way to Spain. It found its way to the hands of British military paymaster, who distributed it to soldiers, who spent it on food and shelter and the basic necessities of military life. The family's role in this operation was crucial. By some accounts, the Rothschilds were moving something on the order of 15 to 20 million pounds in bullion during the years 1812 to 1815. This is an enormous sum, difficult to comprehend by modern standards, far larger than the entire capital of most European banks of the time. It was money that was literally feeding armies, that was the difference between Britain's ability to continue the war against Napoleon and British collapse, French victory, the imposition of Napoleonic dominion over the entire continent. Nathan Rothschild did not become wealthy through this operation exactly. The commissions that were paid to him for moving the gold were only a fraction of the sums involved. If the Rothschilds moved 20 million pounds and charged a commission of 0.5%, they would have earned £100,000. This is a substantial sum, life-changing wealth for most people, but it is only a fraction of what they moved. However, what Nathan Rothschild became through this operation was something more valuable than wealth. He became essential. He became the man without whom the British government could not prosecute its war. And in the economy of power and influence, to be essential is to be wealthy, regardless of the actual sums of money in your coffers. Governments remember who helped them in their hour of need. Governments grant favors to those who have done them great services. More importantly, Nathan was learning something about how to move money on a continental scale. He was learning about the logistics of bullion, about the routes that were safe and the routes that were dangerous, about the people who could be trusted to transport valuable cargo across borders and through war zones without stealing it, without losing it to banditry or military action, without simply disappearing into the night. He was learning about the geography of commerce in wartime, about which ports were still open and which were blockaded, about which merchants were still conducting business and which had been ruined by the wars. He was learning, in other words, the practical details of what would later become one of the greatest fortunes in European history. By 1814 and 1815, as Napoleon's power was finally collapsing, the Rothschilds found themselves at the center of European finance in a way that no previous generation of merchants had achieved. They had connections to the British government. They had managed vast sums. They had moved money across borders that were supposed to be sealed by warfare and law. And now, as the war was coming to an end, as the victorious powers were gathering to redraw the map of Europe, a new question was arising. What would happen to all this money? The armies would be demobilized. The government spending would contract. The vast sums that had been flowing through the channels of warfare would find other channels, or they would disappear. For the Rothschilds, this was not a problem. It was an opportunity. The Battle of Waterloo was fought on June 18, 1815. By the evening of that day, the Grande Armée had been destroyed. The cavalry charges failed. The infantry squares held. The British artillery, positioned on the ridge above the village, poured devastating fire into the French ranks. By evening, as the rain began to fall and the gunfire ceased, Napoleon's army was broken. His abdication was now inevitable. The long wars were effectively over. Europe would be remade at a congress in Vienna, and the map would be redrawn by the victorious powers: Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The world that had been consumed by warfare for more than 2 decades would now enter a period of peace. Everything would change. Around this event, a legend grew. It is a legend that has been repeated in dozens of books, in films, in conversations about the Rothschild family for nearly 2 centuries. The story has taken many forms, but the core narrative remains consistent. The story goes like this. Nathan Rothschild received news of the British victory at Waterloo a full day before the British government's official messengers brought word to London. Using this advanced knowledge, Nathan rushed to the stock exchange and, through a series of complex transactions, made a vast fortune, perhaps millions of pounds, in a single day. Some versions of the story claim that Nathan had personally ridden to Waterloo, had witnessed the battle, and had personally brought the news back to England, crossing the English Channel in the dead of night, riding through rain and darkness. Other versions claim that Nathan had received word through a secret network of couriers, that he had bribed officials to keep the news quiet while he executed his trades, that he had orchestrated a scheme so clever and so ruthless that he had essentially stolen millions from other investors who did not know what he knew. The Battle of Waterloo was fought on June 18, 1815. By the evening of that day, the Grande Armée had been destroyed. The cavalry charges failed. The infantry squares held. The British artillery, positioned on the ridge above the village, poured devastating fire into the French ranks. By evening, as the rain began to fall and the gunfire ceased, Napoleon's army was broken. His abdication was now inevitable. The long wars were effectively over. Europe would be remade at a congress in Vienna, and the map would be redrawn by the victorious powers: Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The world that had been consumed by warfare for more than 2 decades would now enter a period of peace. Everything would change. Around this event, a legend grew. It is a legend that has been repeated in dozens of books, in films, in conversations about the Rothschild family for nearly 2 centuries. The story has taken many forms, but the core narrative remains consistent. The story goes like this. Nathan Rothschild received news of the British victory at Waterloo a full day before the British government's official messengers brought word to London. Using this advanced knowledge, Nathan rushed to the stock exchange and, through a series of complex transactions, made a vast fortune, perhaps millions of pounds, in a single day. Some versions of the story claim that Nathan had personally ridden to Waterloo, had witnessed the battle, and had personally brought the news back to England, crossing the English Channel in the dead of night, riding through rain and darkness. Other versions claim that Nathan had received word through a secret network of couriers, that he had bribed officials to keep the news quiet while he executed his trades, that he had orchestrated a scheme so clever and so ruthless that he had essentially stolen millions from other investors who did not know what he knew. Instead of using his early information to execute a secret scheme to manipulate the market, Nathan appears to have used it to fulfill his existing obligations to the British government. He had been moving money, arranging credit, facilitating the flow of capital to pay Wellington's armies. With the war ending, those obligations continued, but they transformed. Now it was about getting the vast sums that had been advanced by the British government to the Rothschild enterprises and to other lenders and suppliers, repaid in a timely fashion. The victory at Waterloo meant that the war was over, that government expenditures would contract, that the British government would now have to manage its debts. This was information of value, certainly, but the value lay in understanding the implications for policy and finance, not in secretly trading stocks. The actual profitability of the Rothschild enterprises during the Waterloo period was real, but it was not the sudden windfall that legend claims. It was the accumulated result of moving vast sums of money over several years, taking a small percentage of each transaction, being trusted by the British government to handle its most delicate financial affairs, and building a reputation that would bring even more business. By 1815, Nathan Rothschild was wealthy, certainly. He was far richer than he had been 5 years earlier, but he had not become a millionaire through a single brilliant stroke of information trading. His wealth came from consistency, from years of reliable service, from the trust that had accumulated. Yet the legend persisted, and in some ways the legend was more useful to the Rothschilds than the truth would have been. If the world believed that they had become impossibly wealthy through their cleverness, through their secret knowledge, through their manipulation of markets, then people would treat them with a kind of awe, a kind of fear. They would become associated with financial genius, with the ability to manipulate vast sums, with a kind of power that transcended ordinary commerce. People who feared the Rothschilds' power, who believed they possessed secret knowledge and mysterious influence, would be cautious in their dealings with them. People who believed in the legend would not cheat them, would honor their contracts, would treat them with respect born of fear. This association with Waterloo, accurate or not, became central to the Rothschild mystique. It became the moment when they passed from being successful merchants to being legendary figures. It became the origin story in which the family had become mysteriously, almost magically wealthy, not through honest effort, but through cleverness and hidden knowledge. And whether or not this was strictly true, it had profound effects on how they were treated by governments and by other financial enterprises. The legend, in other words, became useful precisely because it was false. What we can say with certainty is this: by 1815, Nathan Rothschild was wealthy enough to be consulted by the British government on major financial matters. He was wealthy enough to move large sums of money without assistance from more established banks. He was wealthy enough to be treated as the equal in financial matters of men who came from old aristocratic families or from Christian banking dynasties that had existed for centuries. And the legend of Waterloo, true or false, had cemented his position in the public imagination. And the Rothschild network was now fully operational. Amschel was managing the Frankfurt Bank. Salomon was established in Vienna, where he was becoming increasingly important to the Austrian government. Nathan was now the preeminent banker in London. Karl was in Naples. James was in Paris, navigating the complexities of Bourbon Restoration politics. By 1815, they had transformed themselves. They were no longer merchants from a ghetto. They were international bankers, and the scale of their operations was beginning to be felt across Europe. After Waterloo, Europe had to be rebuilt. The wars had left nations exhausted, their treasuries drained, their economies disrupted, their populations traumatized by decades of conflict. Austria needed money to re-establish itself as a great power, to recover the territories that had been lost to Napoleon, to maintain its position among the European powers. Prussia needed capital to fortify its territories, to strengthen its army, to position itself for future conflicts. France needed vast sums to pay indemnities to the victorious powers, to reconstruct itself after years of invasion and occupation, to recover its status as a major player in European politics. Britain, though victorious, was debt-laden from the wars and wary of future conflicts, seeking to restructure its finances and find new arrangements that would maintain its dominance. This was the world into which the Rothschild network expanded, and it was a world that seemed designed specifically for them, that played to their particular advantages. Every ruler needed credit. No government could do what needed to be done without borrowing. Every government needed to move money across borders. Every transition, from warfare to peace, from monarchy to constitutional government, from old mercantile systems to new industrial ones, required capital. The Rothschilds understood this landscape intimately. The Rothschilds were uniquely positioned to provide what everyone needed. They had capital. They had accumulated vast sums during the wars, and they had the ability to access more capital through their network of wealthy clients and through their own credit. They had connections to multiple governments. They had proven themselves reliable to the British, and they had relationships with the continental powers as well. They had the network to move money across borders that were otherwise sealed by politics and law, customs barriers and tariffs, national jealousies and suspicions. And they had, most importantly, a reputation for reliability. They had moved vast sums for the British government during the wars. They had done so without theft, without default, without betrayal. They had proven, in the ultimate test of warfare and crisis, that they could be trusted. After Waterloo, Europe had to be rebuilt. The wars had left nations exhausted, their treasuries drained, their economies disrupted, their populations traumatized by decades of conflict. Austria needed money to re-establish itself as a great power, to recover the territories that had been lost to Napoleon, to maintain its position among the European powers. Prussia needed capital to fortify its territories, to strengthen its army, to position itself for future conflicts. France needed vast sums to pay indemnities to the victorious powers, to reconstruct itself after years of invasion and occupation, to recover its status as a major player in European politics. Britain, though victorious, was debt-laden from the wars and wary of future conflicts, seeking to restructure its finances and find new arrangements that would maintain its dominance. This was the world into which the Rothschild network expanded, and it was a world that seemed designed specifically for them, that played to their particular advantages. Every ruler needed credit. No government could do what needed to be done without borrowing. Every government needed to move money across borders. Every transition, from warfare to peace, from monarchy to constitutional government, from old mercantile systems to new industrial ones, required capital. The Rothschilds understood this landscape intimately. The Rothschilds were uniquely positioned to provide what everyone needed. They had capital. They had accumulated vast sums during the wars, and they had the ability to access more capital through their network of wealthy clients and through their own credit. They had connections to multiple governments. They had proven themselves reliable to the British, and they had relationships with the continental powers as well. They had the network to move money across borders that were otherwise sealed by politics and law, customs barriers and tariffs, national jealousies and suspicions. And they had, most importantly, a reputation for reliability. They had moved vast sums for the British government during the wars. They had done so without theft, without default, without betrayal. They had proven, in the ultimate test of warfare and crisis, that they could be trusted. Salomon Rothschild in Vienna was the first to fully exploit this advantage, and his success would become the model for his brothers. Vienna was the capital of the Austrian Empire, and after 1815, the Austrian Empire was the dominant continental power, the chief defender of the old order against revolutionary upheaval. Salomon established himself not merely as a banker, but as a confidant of the imperial government, a man whom ministers of state would consult, whose advice would be heeded, whose opinions on financial matters would shape policy. He arranged massive loans that allowed Austria to consolidate its position after the Napoleonic Wars, that gave the Austrian government the resources it needed to strengthen its military and its position. He facilitated transactions that allowed the Austrian government to continue its existence as a great power. The relationship was symbiotic, mutually beneficial. Salomon needed the Austrian government's patronage to establish himself as a major banker, to build the credibility and the capital base that would make him powerful. The Austrian government needed Salomon's access to capital to maintain its power, to pay its armies, to fund its initiatives. Out of this mutual dependence grew a relationship that lasted for decades, that weathered political crises and revolutions, that became the model for how the Rothschilds would relate to governments throughout the 19th century. Salomon became, in effect, the financial advisor to the Austrian state. He was consulted on currency policy, on international loans, on the financial arrangements that would bind together the concert of Europe, the system that was meant to prevent another general war. Nathan, in London, was operating in a somewhat different context. Britain was the world's preeminent power, and London was becoming the financial capital of the world. The British government had less immediate need for loans than Austria did. It could tax its vast empire and borrow on its own terms, and it had access to capital through the growing British financial markets. But Nathan was becoming indispensable nonetheless, in different ways. He was handling international transactions, moving money for wealthy individuals and for foreign governments, positioning himself as the crucial intermediary between London's vast financial resources and the rest of Europe. By 1820, Nathan Rothschild had established N.M. Rothschild & Sons as a major banking house, one of the largest in Europe. It was no longer an obscure enterprise conducted from modest premises. It was a substantial operation, with capital numbered in millions of pounds, with dozens of clerks and managers, and far-flung international networks of agents and correspondents. Nathan was still in his 40s, still vigorous, still aggressive in his business dealings, but he was being treated by government officials as an equal, as a man whose opinion on financial matters was worth soliciting, as a person whose status transcended his position as a mere merchant. The other brothers were building their empires in their respective cities, each one operating in a somewhat different style, but all of them following the pattern that Mayer Rothschild had established. James in Paris was becoming the principal financial advisor to the Bourbon Restoration. managing massive loans that allowed France to recover from its military defeat and occupation, that gave the French government the resources it needed to maintain order and to rebuild. Karl in Naples was handling transactions for the Italian states and for the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, establishing himself as a crucial intermediary in Mediterranean finance. Amschel in Frankfurt, though his city was smaller and less internationally significant than Vienna or London or Paris, was managing the home base of the enterprise and serving as a crucial junction point for transactions moving between different parts of the Rothschild network. What is remarkable about this period is not any single brilliant transaction, but rather the sheer scale and constancy of their operations. They were not lucky speculators who had struck it rich through a single brilliant coup. They were industrialists of finance, applying systematic methods to the movement of capital, always taking a small percentage of each transaction, always ensuring that their books balanced perfectly, always maintaining relationships with their clients so that the clients would return. A king might find himself in need of funds for any of 1,000 purposes. He would send an emissary to Rothschild. Rothschild would assess the creditworthiness of the king, would calculate the risks, would negotiate a rate of interest that would compensate for those risks, would arrange for the funds to be moved to where they needed to be. If the funds needed to come from London, Nathan would provide them. If they needed to pass through Vienna or another city, Salomon or another brother would facilitate the transaction. The family network would coordinate the whole operation, and money would flow from one place to another, smoothing the operations of state, enabling governments to function. And for each flow of money, for each transaction, the Rothschilds took their percentage. They did not become wealthy through any single transaction. They became wealthy through thousands of transactions, each one small in isolation, each one a minor profit, but collectively amounting to a tide of capital that flowed through their houses and left deposits of profit in its wake. By the 1820s, the Rothschilds were wealthy, not just comfortable, not just prosperous, but wealthy in the way that only a small number of families in Europe were wealthy. They were estimated to control somewhere on the order of tens of millions of pounds, a sum that is difficult to imagine by modern standards when we are accustomed to trillions. They had moved from being accepted as tolerated businessmen within the Jewish ghetto to being treated as equal partners in European power, as men whose opinion mattered, whose resources could reshape the fate of nations. Yet they remained in many ways outsiders. They were Jews in societies that were deeply Christian, where religious prejudice and ancient superstitions about Jewish financial power still held sway. They were self-made men in a world that still valued aristocratic birth, that still believed that power should be inherited, not earned. They had achieved wealth through commerce and finance in an era when land was still considered more respectable than money, when a merchant was considered beneath an aristocrat, however poor. And so, even as they rose to unprecedented heights of financial power, they carried with them a kind of separateness, a sense that they could never fully belong to the world in which they now operated. And yet the wealth was not the only measure of their power. What was perhaps more remarkable was the consistency with which they maintained their ethics, and ethics is perhaps too strong a word, but let us say the consistency with which they maintained their principles. They did not default on their obligations. They did not steal from their clients. They did not engage in the spectacular frauds that were beginning to characterize some of the emerging industrial fortunes. They were, by the standards of the time, scrupulously honest. They kept meticulous records. They maintained the books that Mayer Rothschild had taught them to maintain, the books in which every transaction was recorded, in which every promise was documented, in which there was no room for ambiguity or deception. This honesty was not altruistic, it was simply good business. In a world where communication was slow and where a man's reputation could make or destroy him, honesty was the most valuable commodity. The Rothschilds had understood this from the beginning, and they had built their empire on this understanding. By 1830, each of the brothers was living in a kind of splendor that would have been unimaginable to their grandfather, Amschel Moses, the dealer in coins. Nathan had a mansion in London, Salomon had properties in Vienna, James had established himself in Paris in a style that would have impressed the pre-revolutionary aristocracy. Karl maintained a position in Naples. Amschel was the patriarch of Frankfurt, the keeper of the home offices where the family business was still coordinated. They married within their religion, preserving the family's Jewish identity, even as they accumulated vast wealth and moved in Christian circles. They had children, many children, and these children were being educated to carry on the business. They were learning languages, learning accounting, learning the 1,000 details of international finance. The family was not merely wealthy, it was becoming a dynasty. The Rothschilds were establishing themselves not as a commercial enterprise that might be dissolved by the death of its founders, but as a family concern that would persist across generations, that would adapt to changing circumstances, but maintain its core identity and its core mission: to move money, to coordinate capital across borders, to profit from the gaps and opportunities that existed between different national currencies and credit systems. By 1830, it seemed that the Rothschild family had reached a pinnacle that could not possibly be surpassed. They were everywhere. No major financial transaction in Europe could be conducted without involving a Rothschild house. No government could borrow without consulting a Rothschild banker. They had achieved what might be described as a near monopoly on international finance. But empires reach their heights, and then the terrain changes. The forces that had allowed the Rothschilds to rise to preeminence were beginning, even in 1830, to shift in ways that neither they nor anyone else could fully predict. Nathan Rothschild died on July 28, 1836. He was 59 years old, still in full command of his faculties, still actively managing the London banking house that bore his name, still consulted by the British government on matters of finance and commerce, still watching the markets, still making decisions that would move capital across the continent. And yet, by all accounts, his death was unexpected. He had seemed, by the standards of his time, to have weathered every storm, to have survived every crisis. He had moved vast sums of gold during wartime. He had navigated the peace that followed. He had built a fortune that would have seemed impossible to the young man who arrived in Manchester 4 decades earlier. The man who had seemed to embody the invulnerability of the Rothschild enterprise was gone. His brothers would follow, one by one, like dominoes falling slowly, inexorably. Salomon died in Vienna in 1855. James died in Paris in 1868 at an advanced age, having seen the rise and fall of empires, having navigated the revolutions of 1848, having maintained the family's position through the convulsions of European politics. Karl died in 1855 as well. One by one, the great builders, the men who had transformed themselves from merchants in a ghetto to international financial power, left the stage. Amschel, the oldest and the most conservative, the keeper of the Frankfurt house, lasted longer than any of them. He did not die until 1855, but even he was gone long before the century ended. They left behind them a structure that was remarkable in its solidity. The banking houses in the 5 cities persisted. The names remained carved on the buildings, emblazoned on the letterhead. The capital was substantial, reinvested, and compounded over decades. But something essential had changed. In the second and third generation, the Rothschilds were managers, not pioneers. They were maintaining an empire, not building one. They were defending their position, not expanding it. There is a difference, and that difference, played out over decades, had consequences. Nathan Rothschild died on July 28, 1836. He was 59 years old, still in full command of his faculties, still actively managing the London banking house that bore his name, still consulted by the British government on matters of finance and commerce, still watching the markets, still making decisions that would move capital across the continent. And yet, by all accounts, his death was unexpected. He had seemed, by the standards of his time, to have weathered every storm, to have survived every crisis. He had moved vast sums of gold during wartime. He had navigated the peace that followed. He had built a fortune that would have seemed impossible to the young man who arrived in Manchester 4 decades earlier. The man who had seemed to embody the invulnerability of the Rothschild enterprise was gone. His brothers would follow, one by one, like dominoes falling slowly, inexorably. Salomon died in Vienna in 1855. James died in Paris in 1868, at an advanced age, having seen the rise and fall of empires, having navigated the revolutions of 1848, having maintained the family's position through the convulsions of European politics. Karl died in 1855 as well. One by one, the great builders, the men who had transformed themselves from merchants in a ghetto to international financial power, left the stage. Amschel, the oldest and the most conservative, the keeper of the Frankfurt house, lasted longer than any of them. He did not die until 1855, but even he was gone long before the century ended. They left behind them a structure that was remarkable in its solidity. The banking houses in the 5 cities persisted. The names remained carved on the buildings, emblazoned on the letterhead. The capital was substantial, reinvested and compounded over decades, but something essential had changed. In the second and third generation, the Rothschilds were managers, not pioneers. They were maintaining an empire, not building one. They were defending their position, not expanding it. There is a difference, and that difference, played out over decades, had consequences. The world was changing in ways that were not favorable to the kind of business that had made the Rothschilds wealthy. Industrial capitalism was beginning to mature, to develop new forms, new structures. Joint stock companies were emerging, companies that could raise capital not from a single banking house or a single wealthy family, but from thousands of shareholders, each contributing a small sum, each owning a fractional stake. Stock exchanges were becoming more efficient, more transparent, more rule-bound. They were less dependent on the kind of privileged information and personal networks that had been the Rothschilds' greatest advantage. A man who could move information faster than others, who could understand currency fluctuations through his network of correspondence, who could move money across borders through private channels. Such a man had been invaluable. But technology was slowly eroding these advantages. Telegraph wires were being laid. News that had once taken weeks to travel now moved in hours. The information advantage was shrinking. Governments were also becoming more sophisticated in their financing, developing new strategies and new instruments. Rather than borrowing from individual banking houses, arrangements that were in some ways humiliating, involving as they did a kind of petitioning to a wealthy man, governments were beginning to issue bonds directly to the public, bonds that could be bought and sold on open exchanges. This was a profound change. It democratized access to credit, which was good for the world, but not particularly good for the Rothschilds, whose whole business model had depended on being the intermediary, the necessary middleman. If the government could borrow directly from thousands of citizens, why would it pay the commissions and fees that a banking house would charge? More broadly, the age of aristocratic power was waning, though it did not know it yet. The revolutions of 1848, though they did not overthrow the old order in most of Europe, shook it profoundly. Democratic movements were beginning to gain traction, beginning to challenge the assumption that power should be concentrated in the hands of a small number of families. The notion that a handful of powerful families should control the finance of Europe, that ministers of state should bow before bankers, began to seem not merely unjust, but increasingly untenable. The world was moving slowly in the direction of more open, more democratic systems. After 1875, the world moved further in the direction of public finance, of government bonds issued to the masses, of joint stock banking and industrial capitalism, of bureaucratic organization and democratic institutions. The Rothschilds remained wealthy, remained influential, remained players in major financial affairs. But they ceased to be unique, ceased to be indispensable. They became in many ways just another powerful family navigating an increasingly democratic, increasingly bureaucratic, increasingly complex world. The slow turning of history meant that the extraordinary position that Mayer Rothschild had built, that his 5 sons had expanded, that had seemed unassailable in 1830, began to diminish. Not dramatically, not in a single moment of catastrophic decline, but gradually, like a ship receding from view as it sails across the horizon. The Rothschild Empire began to become less central to the story of Europe, less essential, less mythologized. What remains of the Rothschild Empire? This is the question that matters now, in the darkness, as the story comes to its quiet close. The family still exists, the banking houses still operate, though they are no longer the monoliths they once were. The Rothschild name still carries weight in financial circles, though it no longer carries quite the same mystique. The mansions still stand in London and Vienna and Paris and Frankfurt, museums now mostly, or subdivided into apartments, their interiors preserved as monuments to a vanished age. The wealth persisted, though it was distributed, subdivided, diluted across generations and across the upheavals of the 20th century. Wars came that were beyond the power of any banking family to prevent or profit from. Revolutions came that targeted precisely the kinds of financial power that the Rothschilds had accumulated. Taxes came that took portions of their fortune. Technologies came that made their particular advantages obsolete. But something remained. The letters persist. The ledgers remain, preserved in archives, open to scholarship. The historical record endures. And what it shows, when you read carefully, is not a conspiracy but something more interesting. The story of how a family of merchants managed to transform themselves through skill, through honesty, through the cultivation of relationships, through the patient accumulation of small advantages across many years. The lesson that Mayer Rothschild left, if we read the records carefully, is not that money is power or that bankers rule the world. The lesson is that trust is currency, that a reputation for honoring your obligations is worth more than gold, that in a world of chaos and uncertainty, the family or institution or person who can be relied upon to do what they say they will do, to deliver what they promise, to record their transactions honestly and completely, that person or family will prosper. This is not a thrilling lesson. It does not explain the Rothschilds' rise through conspiracy or genius or ruthlessness, as some have claimed. But it is the truer lesson. It is the lesson that the ledgers themselves teach, if you read them carefully, if you look past the romantic narratives and the anti-Semitic libels and the self-aggrandizing family accounts to see what actually happened. Mayer Rothschild was a man who became wealthy because he kept his promises. His sons maintained his legacy because they lived by the same principle. They lent money to governments, knowing that those governments might fall, but knowing also that the ledger was honest and that history would eventually bear witness to that honesty. The Rothschilds did not invent modern capitalism. They did not create the stock market or the bond market or the mechanisms through which capital moves in the modern world. But they were among the first to understand that these mechanisms could be navigated by people who were smart, careful, and trustworthy. What remains, then, is not an empire exactly, but a story. And the story has traveled further than any of them imagined. It has been told and retold, distorted and mythologized, used to justify conspiracy theories and to illustrate principles of business ethics. It has become part of the culture, a shorthand for either the power of finance or the dangers of financial power, depending on who is telling the tale. But the truth remains in the archives, in the letters between the brothers, in the accounting books, in the records of transactions conducted in the shadow of wars and revolutions. The truth persists. It is the truth of ordinary men doing ordinary work with uncommon care. It is the truth of patience rewarded. It is the truth of a reputation carefully built and carefully maintained, becoming a form of capital more valuable than any currency. The ledger is closed now. The lamp is dimming. The keeper has read the accounts, traced the lines of commerce, followed the movement of gold and silver and promises through the darkness of the 19th century. And what they found there was not the story of a conspiracy, but the story of a family that understood something fundamental, that in a world of boundaries and borders and nationalisms and wars, the only truly portable wealth is trust. The only truly valuable asset is a name that means something. Sleep now. The accounts balance. The story is complete. And that is what remains. The memory of a name that once meant something. The echo of transactions conducted in candlelit rooms. The fading image of a lane so narrow that the houses leaned toward one another, and where from a single family there emerged not conquest, but influence, not force, but the quiet power of being necessary. The Rothschilds are gone now, or passing into history in the way all things pass. But the principle remains. Honesty pays. Promises kept accumulate. In a world of chaos, trust is the only gold that never tarnishes. The ledger closes, the lamp goes dark, and you drift, gentle reader, into the kind of sleep where old memories of old money move like shadows across a dimming page, where the clinking of coins becomes, in the dream, only the sound of wind in the eaves of old houses, where the line between the story and the sleeper blurs, and all that remains is the sense of a world that was, that mattered once, and now belongs to history and to the peace of those who have learned to let it go. And that is what remains. Sleep well.